Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's NCVER webinar on effective teaching and learning, teacher perspectives on what works best. Just a reminder that we're recording today's webinar and we'll be making it available on our portal shortly. My name is Tabatha Griffin and I'm going to be presenting today. So we're using Zoom today, and for those of you who might not be familiar with this platform, I'll just go through a couple of things that you might find useful. This is the Zoom interface, and you'll see a couple of settings there that might be useful. So you can check your audio settings on the left-hand side there, and then you'll see the Q&A function, which enables you to ask questions throughout the webinar. Now, for privacy, only we'll be able to see your questions, but we will acknowledge all questions received either throughout the webinar or afterwards via email. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their continued spiritual connection to land, and I pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. And today I am presenting from the lands of the Kaurna people, the beautiful Adelaide Plains. I'd like to welcome our two panellists today. We've got Susanne Francisco, who's a senior lecturer at Sturt University, and Debra Lunt, who's professional development lecturer at Metropolitan TAFE. Thank you both so much for joining us, and we look forward to hearing from you. You'll get a chance to pipe in and have a few things to say later on after the presentation. So today I want to talk about some research that we have just recently published. And this project aimed to identify effective vet teaching practices which account for the various ways in which people learn. So in this presentation, I'll talk about three main elements of this research. Firstly, I'll cover off how teachers understand how their learners how they learn, how students best learn. Then I'll cover off the teaching strategy that teachers use in the classroom and what they can do when this isn't working. And lastly, I'll talk about how teachers can be supported to deliver high quality training. So after I give the presentation, we'll have a short panel style discussion with our two panelists, and then we'll have some time to answer some questions from the audience. So why did we do this project? Well, high quality training in the vet system is an important and ongoing priority for government. And we've seen this in recent government work, such as the Vet Workforce Blueprint and the revised standards for RTOs. And this particular project was conducted through NCVER's SON research program, demonstrating the important government interest in this area. But the focus on building a high quality vet workforce is not limited to government. There are other stakeholders that have an interest in this, of course, and they have an important role to play. So these include industry, vet providers, peak bodies and regulators, for example. And the reason why all of these groups have such an important role to play is that highly skilled vet teachers are going to play an important role in developing the skilled workers required in the Australian labour market. And I'm sure you've seen these figures put out by the JSA, but the JSA have shown that 90% of projected employment growth will require post-secondary qualifications. And more than half of the critical skills required will be expected to be provided through the vet sector. And so the vet workforce is going to have a pivotal role in delivering these skills. So what did we do in this research? We started with interviews with teachers who had been recognised for teaching excellence. So these were individuals who were either winners or finalists in Vet Teacher Trainer of the Year awards. And these individuals were selected by the project team in consultation with the project sponsors and the project advisory committee. Now, the teachers that agreed to participate in this research spanned across a range of RTO types and sizes, and they delivered a breadth of subject areas. We followed these interviews with a number of focus groups with additional teachers, but also some additional participants who are involved in leading teaching teams. And this was to sort of test some of the findings from the interviews and get a broader perspective. So what we really wanted to learn from these teachers that had been recognised was how they approach their practice. So what do they do to understand how their learners are learning? What sort of strategies do they use in the classroom to deal with the diverse learners that they have? And what have they done to support, what support have they received to get to this point of delivering excellence in teaching? Now, just a quick note about terminology here. I'll probably default to using the term vet teacher quite a fair bit, but I'm really talking about vet practitioners, vet trainers, vet educators. We did find in this research, and it has been reported previously, that the way that vet educators identify themselves is meaningful and important. But for simplicity, I'll probably just default to vet teachers, but I may mix it up a little bit. I will come back to this point a little bit more again later on. So how do vet teachers understand how adults learn? There are numerous examples of teacher capability frameworks out there, and many specify that teachers need to have at least a general understanding of basic educational theory. But educational theory is not simple or agreed. It's an evolving space, and it's embedded in neuroscience. So educational theory requires a connection between the science of learning and the practice of teaching. One way this has occurred over decades has been through the concept of learning styles. So in practice, this involves identifying a learning style of a student and then matching your teaching practice to that learning style. But the literature shows over 70 different classification systems have been used in this space. So it's really hard for vet practitioners to know which ones to focus on and how to apply it to their teaching. And in addition to this, more recent research has provided that, there's little evidence actually to support this practice, even though it is still quite often used in all education sectors, not just vet. More contemporary research based on the neuroscience of learning and the limitations of the working memory have generated new understandings of learning and new educational practices. So this includes things like cognitive load theory. So when we asked the participating teachers in this research about how they approach understanding the learning processes of their students, a variety of methods and perspectives were shared. Some still like to identify learning styles of their students, but it tended to be broader than this. They were really considering the learning preferences of their students. So we're talking about two different concepts here: learning styles as defined through those educational theories, and learning preferences, which are reported by students as to how they like to learn. The teachers also acknowledge that many people are multimodal in how they like to learn, and that it can vary for an individual depending on the day and what they're learning. And they also considered more contemporary theories like cognitive load theory. As you would expect, there was also a big focus on learning needs. So we're talking about a third concept here. These are really the identified challenges that students have that require support for them to overcome them. And so teachers often resorted talking to learning needs either instead of learning preferences or in addition to learning preferences. And this is probably due to the requirement to support individual learner needs in the standards for RTOs. So this is something that teachers have been thinking about for a long time. So how do vet teachers do this assessment of learning needs and learning preferences in practice? Well, this table shows a variety of activities that they undertake. These were the things reported by our interviewed teachers. And these are often conducted during pre-enrolment or enrolment, or through our orientation sessions, or through the whole course of the study. For these teachers, these various activities had a broader goal than merely understanding learning preferences. They were implemented to develop both an understanding of the students as learners, but also as people, and also to encourage the students to consider their own learning. And they were also conducted to help them feel comfortable in the class training environment. The importance of building relationships and rapport with students was emphasised by almost all of the interviewed teachers. And the value of this was in building respect, trust, and motivation in the student, as well as creating an environment where it could be more easily identified if the particular teaching strategies being used were not working well with an individual. It was noted that this process of building rapport and building these relationships is easier where you have access to students for longer periods of time. And it was often easier in face-to-face situations as opposed to in the online environment. But some teachers reported various ways that they still attempt to do this in short courses and online, and in the online teaching environment. The time and effort spent on these various activities did depend on the context of the course and also the student cohort. So for short courses or where students were more experienced learners, these types of activities were kept to a minimum if conducted at all. Not all teachers reported that they make a significant attempt to understand student learning preferences, and noting that we're not talking about learning needs here, we're talking about their preferences. So why was this, and is it a problem? There were two main reasons for not doing this. The teachers either had confidence that their training delivery would cater to all the styles and preferences of their students, or they had a very sound understanding of their particular student cohort and what would work for them. So this was quite often with teachers who were specialising in areas that either attracting, hands-on learners or particular cohorts like First Nations learners or migrants, for example. Did this seem to be a problem? Well, while not all teachers took the deliberate actions to understand student learning preferences, this didn't prevent them from getting to know their students. So they were still able to assess if things were not working. So in these particular situations, it didn't seem to be problematic at all. So most of the teachers reported using an overarching teaching strategy that they used for all students. This was a planned strategy, which they adapted when they needed to. So I want to spend the next few minutes talking about this strategy. When we asked the teachers what I thought was a relatively simple question, which was if and how they respond to the learning preferences of their students in their teaching, a really complex answer emerged. So in addition to describing how they incorporate elements of educational theory, which is what I thought that they would focus on, they also started raising issues of student learning support needs, ways for keeping students engaged, and how they assess the competency of their students. And then spanning all of these things was the content development and compliance work that they do. So this encompasses the development and implementation of the necessary learning resources and processes that they use to ensure that training package requirements are met, as well as additional industry needs. And then, of course, the evidence gathering for compliance purposes as well. So the four elements in those boxes in the middle row is what comprises the planned overarching teaching strategy that I want to talk about, with the acknowledgement that this is adapted when needed. So the four main elements are using a variety of teaching approaches, identifying and addressing learning and support needs, ensuring student engagement, and conducting assessment with adaptations if required. Now, depending on how these things are practiced, these four elements can and do overlap. And I'll just go through each of these to show how these teachers were implementing these in practice. So the first is using a variety of teaching approaches, and this draws on the various educational theories and aims to provide opportunities for students to learn in the ways that they prefer. It also teaches students to learn in different ways, which is an important transferable skill. It was noted, unsurprisingly, that not all students enjoy learning in all of the ways offered. And some teachers reported that they very specifically explained to their students the importance of being able to learn in different ways, and that the ability to do this would be a fantastic transferable skill that would hold them in good stead going forward. And in fact, the importance of students learning how to learn was raised. And there was a suggestion made that the language that we were using around teaching practice could be reframed, with the focus shifting from the toolkit that the teacher has to including building the toolkit of the students for lifelong learning. And I thought that that was a really good point. So putting this element into practice included examples of mixing instructional materials and styles, bite-sized learning, which aligned with cognitive load theory. This also helps keep students engaged, going on the learning journey with the student, guiding them along the way, and peer-to-peer learning. This was used very effectively in some scenarios, but the teachers did suggest that in others it needed some judgment. The second element is about addressing student learning needs and the provision of support. Now, this project did not set out to fully investigate how teachers accommodate and provide support for identified learning needs. And in fact, running parallel to this project was another research project that was looking at supports over the learner journey. That project has just been published, so if you haven't had a chance to look at that, you might want to have a look. But most teachers, when we interviewed them in this project, they did talk about this when describing their teaching strategies. And they discussed the overlap between student learning needs and preferences. So, for example, a student who's been identified as dyslexic, for example, is probably not likely to prefer reading and writing as a way to learn. So the main strategy used in this element was to create an inclusive learning environment. The teachers also talked about individualised support and reasonable adjustment, and they also talked about holistic support, especially for disadvantaged cohorts. And again, the importance of relationship building was raised, this time in the context of helping them to understand when and why students might need support, with the understanding that this can change over the student journey. There was a strong focus on student engagement in the teachers' teaching strategies, with the explanation that students will not learn effectively if they're not engaged. So student engagement forms the third element of the teaching strategy. Again, short sessions, similar to the bite-sized learning described earlier, was effective, making things fun, creating a relaxed environment for students where they feel comfortable. Understanding and building motivation and, again, relationships was highlighted here as important. And the importance of reading the room was raised multiple times as a way to monitor student engagement. The final element regards assessment. And while we're used to hearing about reasonable adjustment for students with identified challenges, this was more in the context of student preferences and the challenges that perhaps haven't been formally identified. So strategies described included verbal assessment rather than written. This was a really common one. Similar to mixing up teaching practices in the classroom, the teachers also spoke about mixing up assessment methods as a way to provide opportunities for students to demonstrate competency in different ways. And this also alleviates the over-reliance on written assessment. And lastly, enabling the students to shape how assessment was done. This enables students to draw on their own preferred learning methods. So a couple of great examples here was a teacher who had designed a comic strip assessment task for her class of mostly young boys who were really good at drawing. And then there was the teacher who had introduced yarning circles into her classes of First Nations students. So what about when the overarching strategy isn't working well? What did teachers report doing then? Well, they adapt their teaching in various ways when this overarching strategy isn't working. And they describe doing this at either the class level or the individual level. So at the class level, they identify issues by reading the room, which is what I mentioned before, but also seeking feedback from students. And then in this scenario, they would look at modifying their strategy depending on the issues that have been identified. So they might shift tactics on the spot if they identify issues, while they're teaching in the classroom, or they might incorporate different teaching methodologies in their teacher plans, following feedback from students. At the individual level, this occurred when specific individual learning needs and/or preferences were identified that were not being catered for through the overarching strategy. And this was when individual adaptations were usually offered. And an example of this, which I guess shows the difference between a learning need and a learning preference, was a teacher who delivered VET for secondary school students. He did not generally give homework to his students, but there was one particular student who preferred learning outside of the classroom and really wanted homework. So he gave him homework. How transferable is this strategy? Now, the size of this research project precludes us from saying too much about this, but the interviews did highlight 4 scenarios, 4 situations where the strategy might not be directly transferable and might require some tweaking. The first is in teaching theory versus practical skills. These types of sessions will often run differently, and it was more than the obvious practical versus non-practical nature. And it was suggested by the teachers that it's much harder to accommodate different learning preferences in the practical sessions, even though a lot of students actually prefer those. But it was difficult to cater to everybody, particularly if they were being conducted in simulated or real workplaces. There were also mixed views on how well the strategy can be used in the online environment compared to in face-to-face delivery, with questions over how well student engagement could be maintained, and the needs and preferences identified and accommodated. So some noted that building rapport can be more difficult in the online environment, and others suggested that elements of the teaching strategy had been neglected in the shift online, particularly when this was done quickly as it was through COVID. But there were other teachers that provided examples of where they've been really successful in these areas. So I think it comes down to the experience of the teacher in delivering online and perhaps the professional development they've received in that space. The third was classroom versus workplace delivery. Look, relatively few of the interviewed teachers were able to talk about workplace delivery, but it did come up in the focus group discussions. And these discussions revealed that workplace delivery is more likely to be conducted by VET practitioners who perhaps see themselves as trainers or supervisors rather than educators. So here, just sort of circling back to my earlier comment about how VET teachers and trainers identify themselves and how this can change how they approach their delivery. So in this scenario, where trainers or supervisors were doing the delivery, there was a suggestion that they might be more likely to fall back on their own personal experience as to how they were trained themselves, whether that was good or bad. But I really hesitate to generalise to all workplace trainers here, and I don't think it's just limited to workplace trainers either. So I think that's a space that would really benefit from some more investigation. And the last one was a difference between training and working in some industries was highlighted as an issue for the teaching strategy. And some teachers suggested that they need to be mindful of the industry workplace environment in which their students intend to work to avoid setting up unrealistic expectations about how they'll be taught and communicated with in the workplace. So they were hesitant to introduce too many concessions in response to student learning preferences. So an example here was for nursing students, where they'd moved from a classroom environment into quite a chaotic hospital environment. So how can we or the sector facilitate the development of higher level teaching skills? As I said earlier, the teachers who were interviewed for this research had all been recognised for excellence in their teaching, and the interviews with them revealed several personal characteristics. They were passionate both about teaching and the industries in which they worked. They were teaching for what you might call the right reasons. So they either felt very strongly about developing people, in particular young people or disadvantaged people, or they felt really passionate about giving back to their industry that they felt had been good to them. They were lifelong learners. They wanted to continuously improve themselves and their practice. And they demonstrated self-knowledge and self-awareness. They were willing to put aside their ego to take on feedback from others to improve their practice. So this suggests that attracting the right kind of people into vet teaching roles is important. And this raised a discussion with the research participants about natural teaching ability. And while some people do seem to have a natural talent in this, it was suggested that this is indeed a skill that can be developed. So how do we go beyond the skills developed in their initial teacher training into that higher level teaching skills that we would love to see across the sector? So in addition to doing the TAE or other forms of initial teacher training, and in addition to many of the professional development activities that these teachers undertake, these are the types of activities that our research participants had found particularly useful in further developing their teaching skills. So there's a lot of different things here: mentoring, participating in communities of practice, problem-solving sessions with other teachers, team teaching, and also being a learner, putting themselves in the student position. What I'd like you to note from all of these suggestions is that it emphasises the importance and value of teachers learning from each other. So fostering opportunities for teachers to connect and share their experiences and their knowledge and their learnings is an important element of teacher development, and it's really valuable for new teachers, but also for those with substantial experience. So in addition to these things that they said they'd found really useful, there were a number of things that they said they would find useful if they could access them. And these included things like being able to draw on the skills and knowledge and practices of teaching award winners. There was a mention that they sort of disappear into the sunset a little bit, and it would be great to be able to learn from them more. Resources on how to develop the skill of learning how to learn in adults. Videos of teacher approaches in the classroom or online, and in particular vet-focused videos would be welcome, as opposed to school-focused videos, which are more common. Having access to a reflective practices toolkit, having access to a network to enable collaborative development of resources and practices, and access to sample session plans, particularly those that include universal design for learning strategies, especially with a vet focus and with an adult focus. Most of these things online are for young people and for in the school sector. So the desire for additional resources is not meant to suggest that information or professional development opportunities for teachers are limited. And in fact, the opposite is true, with one participant making the point that, you know, navigating all the options and finding the most relevant resources can be really tricky. So to help address this issue, part of this project involved pulling together a collection of practical resources for teachers that we have made available on NCVER's VocEd Plus website, and I'll provide a link to that at the end if you want to have a look at it. But despite all the availability of all these things, there are some additional resources that teachers would find really helpful. So how do we implement these higher level teaching skills once these teachers have developed them. We identified 3 areas that might require some structural change or a shift in the sector's culture to be able to implement excellence in teaching practices. And I'll quickly run through each of these. The first is structured support and quality induction for new teachers. This was viewed as critical, not only to enable the development of higher level skills in teachers, but also for retention of teachers in the sector. This is particularly important in the current climate of skills shortages, which is certainly being felt in the vet workforce. Examples were given of effective induction programs, but it was noted that these require time and resources, and they're often driven by individuals or small groups who are doing this alongside their normal work. Having dedicated time and space to develop and try new things was the second requirement for implementing teaching excellence. One teacher described how she was given free rein to experiment in her teaching while she was completing her bachelor's degree. But most vet teachers are time poor and they don't have this opportunity. And working out how to do this within the constraints or the perceived constraints of training packages is also difficult. So one potential solution for this that was suggested in the focus groups was for teachers to do this iteratively. So building up a suite of materials and practices over time, and having the support of managers was deemed very important to allow that time and flexibility to experiment with new ways of doing things. The final point is that this research highlighted the complexity of teaching in vet. As I showed earlier, the teaching process involves many different elements, and these teachers are thinking about many different things as they're pulling these classes together. And the skills and the human element of teaching needs to be acknowledged. The teachers argued that they need a degree of freedom in their teaching so that they can use their own judgment in determining how best to teach their particular cohorts. And they need to be able to draw on their own individual styles and strengths. And again, managing this in a compliance-focused environment can be challenging. In relation to recognition of teaching skills, the issue of progression and pathways for vet teachers was raised, with the point being made that while progression opportunities were really important, it often meant that they were moving from the classroom into higher level management type positions, with the unintended cost of that obviously being their high level teaching skills being moved out of the classroom. So I've just skimmed over the content of this research, but if you'd like to know more, the report and some additional documents are available from the NCVER portal. I've provided the link there so you can go and find it. And as I mentioned earlier, the project involved collating a collection of practical teaching resources, and these have been housed in the refreshed vet practitioner resource on our VocEd Plus website. And I've provided the link there for you to go and have a look at that as well. So you've heard enough from me for now. I would really like to invite our 2 panelists to show their faces again. And I'd like to invite them to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their respective roles, and then we will have a little bit of a panel discussion. Debra, I might go to you first.
Thanks, Tabatha, and thanks for inviting me to join you and Susanne today. I work in professional development at North Metropolitan TAFE across in Perth, and have done so actually for the last 16 years. So yeah, your research has just been a great insight, not only into sort of teachers' perspectives across the nation, but I'm pleased to say we're aligned to a lot of what you've found. So thanks again for having me.
That's great, Debra. Thank you. And Susanne.
And thank you for having me as well, Tabatha, and thank you for a very interesting presentation. That was really valuable. I'm a senior lecturer with Sturt University, and prior to that, I had more than 15 years as a TAFE teacher. in a nutshell, what Tabatha mentioned earlier that she'd ask us what our role is. So I've been thinking, what is my role? At a broad picture, I see my role as supporting the learning of vet teachers. That includes in the workplace, mentoring arrangements, action research projects. But crucial to this role is the work that I do as a teacher at Sturt University, teaching vet teachers. And the research that I do, looking at how vet teachers learn and how best to support vet teacher learning. We know that the vet teachers that have got a qualification, a university qualification, are more likely to undertake more professional learning as well. So there's so much intertwining of these things. And thank you for having me here, Tabatha.
Thanks, Suzanne. And yeah, I take your point there about vet educators. I suppose they might see themselves as that have done a higher ed degree, probably fall more into that group of seeing themselves as educators, as opposed to perhaps those that have come through industry and done a TAE and, you know, see themselves as vet trainers. So we keep seeing this issue of how they identify, how they self-identify, and how their different teaching behaviours align with that, keep coming up over and over again. So look, I've got a few questions that I'd love to pose to both of you. I've just presented on some of the mechanisms that the teachers use and find helpful in further developing their own teaching skills. I'd love to know how they align with what you see in your own research and in your own practices. Perhaps I'll go to you first, Debra.
Okay, thanks, Tabatha. Well, look, I think, 16 years working in professional development at North Metro, it's fair to say the organisation really recognises the importance of ongoing learning for educators in the vet sector. And that's regardless of whether it's new practitioners coming in straight from industry or whether it's perhaps more experienced people who, might have perhaps plateaued in their kind of teaching in their teaching practice, and they're really looking for new ideas and wanting to regenerate their teaching practices. If I can just share with you briefly two frameworks which we've had quite a bit to do with over the last decade or so. One being instructional intelligence, which was developed by the Canadian academic Barry Bennett from the University of Toronto. What's been interesting about instructional intelligence is the focus is actually on student learning, and yet it provides this incredible conceptual framework in which teachers can really reflect on their own teaching repertoire and their own strategies for getting students to learn. So, II provides techniques on how to structure learning activities, really how to intentionally design and deliver engaging learning experiences for our students. More recently, Universal Design for Learning, which is another framework that we've taken on board, I really think that sort of gives even a deeper dive into who our learners are, what barriers they face, and how we can design learning experiences to be more accessible. And interestingly, I've found both those frameworks complement very much the work we're doing, be that with our new lecturers or be that, as I say, with more experienced lecturers. Fortunately, with our new lecturers, we also have a very strong mentoring program at North Metro. So that really gets them into the space. And then by coming on to do something like instructional intelligence with us for 10 weeks, they're able to really pick up on their pedagogical practice. And after that, they're usually tempted to sort of play with technology and integrate that into their teaching repertoire via the UDL framework.
Yeah, thanks, Debra. And one thing I found interesting when I was interviewing the teachers as part of this project was sometimes I'd ask them if they knew about Universal Design for Learning, for example, and Some of them did not know about it, but when they described their practice, it was very much aligned with UDL.
Look, that's such a great point you make, and I think that's this, that relates back to this idea of being well, actually, Barry Bennett refers to being consciously competent as opposed to accidentally adequate,
Yeah.
which I love. But I think, very often we're doing great things in learning environments, but we're perhaps not sort of consciously aware of that. And if we can become more consciously aware of what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we're doing it, I think that gives great strength to our profession, because we're developing a common language so that we can get onto webinars such as this and have these kinds of conversations. We can talk about why we're doing things with students and with colleagues, and we can then sit down and have real authentic conversations with auditors around what we're doing, why we're doing, and how we're doing it. So that common language, which comes about through such frameworks as Universal Design for Learning and instructional intelligence, they've been really important for us at North Metro.
Thanks, Debra. Yeah, that's a really good point you make about conversations with auditors too. I like that.
Yeah.
Susanne, I'd love to go to you now to ask your thoughts on this.
Thank you, Tabatha. I guess there's 4 key areas I can respond to in relation to that. The first one, you were phrasing it around good teachers at one stage in your presentation, and I guess the issue is around good teaching, the notion that it's not the individual. We can't just say it's the individual who has to be a good teacher. We need a systematic approach to supporting good vet teaching and quality vet teaching. And I noticed toward the end of your presentation that you were looking at ways that the system can support good vet teaching, and we need the burden of good vet teaching to be falling on the system, not just on that individual teacher, because then you've got good teacher, bad teacher, but what's the system doing about it? So that's the first thing. The next thing is I was surprised that I didn't see the notion of adult learning principles come through there, the responses from the participants. But Debra's point earlier about, your point and Debra's comment about UDL being sort of part of actually what they do, I suspect that adult learning principles were probably an important part of what the good teachers did, the people who were using good teaching practices did. But I guess a systematic support for the use of adult learning principles is fairly important. The next thing that came through for me was that notion of relationship building. And you mentioned it a couple of times, the importance of relationship building. And that fits in with my research around the professional learning of adults, that relationship building is important. The final thing that you mentioned, teachers like to learn from each other. And that comes through in my research. One of the places I know teachers like to learn from each other is in the tea room or in the local coffee shop. And so keeping these places available within the workspace or easily accessed by teachers can be a crucial way to support teacher learning. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Susanne. Look, you raise a couple of really great points there. I particularly appreciate your comment about it being a system issue. And I think that if we can take what we learn from these teachers who are, doing quite a good job and work out how we can build those into a system that supports all teachers would be really valuable. And then your final point about teachers liking to talk about this stuff in the tea room. Again, I think that highlights that flexibility, having a little bit of flexibility, a little bit of time and a little bit of space in the workplace to be able to have those conversations, I think is really important and valuable. So my next question, and we might have covered it off a little bit, but what else do you think can be done to support the development of teaching skills in vet teachers? What do you think would be a practical thing that we could put into this system to really help sort of pull everybody up to a higher level? Perhaps I'll go to you first, Susanne, this time.
Good, thank you. Well, we know that undertaking an undergraduate degree in adult and vocational education is a powerful support for very good vet teaching. So that's as a starting point. My research shows that the vet teaching workplace can enable and it can constrain vet teacher learning. So there's a whole range of ways the vet teaching workplace can be set up to help vet teachers become better teachers. There are a lot of vet teaching workplaces that are set up in such a way that that learning is constrained. And not the least of those, you'll think I just want to have a cup of tea all the time, but not the least of those is providing a tea room or a lunch room or a place where that can happen. And then the final thing, I've seen powerful learning happen, and as well as local site development, but powerful learning happen through well-supported action research projects where vet teachers identify an issue that they're addressing and they're supported to work together as a small team to address that issue, and that supports their own learning. It addresses, that helps them work out how to support the issue, work toward managing the issue, and it also develops leadership skills. So those three key areas I think are important for me.
Yeah, thanks, Susanne. And it reminds me that we can't forget the diversity that we see in the vet workforce and in RTOs as well. So, not every vet teacher is working in a TAFE with a team around them. They're not all working in a large RTO where there's a team around them. We have many small RTOs with a small number of teachers. And so I think we need to think about, different methodologies, I suppose, that might help support these teachers that are in different environments. And also, those teachers that are sessional, they don't have the same professional development opportunities often. We know that as well. Debra, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes, look, I think, Susanne raises such an important point around informal places of learning, where people can get together and have those more informal chats around sharing practice. Something that we're working hard on at North Metro is, developing this idea of peer coaching, where people might come and attend some professional learning, but how do we prevent that encapsulation of learning that's gone on in the learning environment? Well, research, I think, from way back in the 1980s with Beverly Showers and Bruce Joyce found some very interesting findings when, it didn't matter whether it was a specialist giving the professional learning, if a colleague could take back something, in our case, to the portfolio that they'd learned and share that with their peers, there was an incredible increase in terms of that practice being adopted out in, I'm going to call it portfolio land within our context. So I really think peer coaching, particularly as I say in the context of our organisation, is really beneficial actually, and we even have a small clause in our expression of interest when people come in to work with us, that part of the deal is that they will be they're quite okay to be tapped on the shoulder, to perhaps run some professional learning, or to just be doing that in that informal setting with their peers back in the portfolio. The other thing we have, which is perhaps a more informal space, is every fortnight we run a community of practice online via Teams, and that's I run that with a colleague, and that's been a really good space for people to not just be showcasing their best practice, but to be having some of the important conversations that about the changing sort of the nature of VET. It's always changing, and it's a safe space for colleagues to be able to do that. A recent example we had was, someone who'd been out in a workplace trainer and just sharing with us how the professional learning that he'd done in the 10-week program, how he'd adopted that to his to his current situation where he's working with a mining company in the CBD in Perth. And one of the really big takeaways for him was exactly what you've been referring to, Tabatha, in your session today, about personal relationships and building that, sort of safe learning environment, really getting to know one another. So, yes, communities of
Yeah.
practice, peer coaching are certainly ways to move forward, I think.
Yeah, that's great, Debra. And it reminds me too, when I was doing the interviews for this project, the teachers really loved and welcomed the opportunity to reflect on what they do. So part of the things that you're talking about, the community of practice and talking about their practices, provides that opportunity, that space where you can just stop for a moment and think about what you do and reflect on it, which I think is a valuable activity. And some of the teachers talked about having that, self-reflective, toolkit in their bag that they draw on. So they're constantly looking at what they do, thinking about what they do, and thinking about how they can improve what they do.
And yeah, I think, if I can just come in there again, I mean, this is the benefit, isn't it, of lifelong learning for all of us. Susanne mentioned the importance of an undergrad degree, and I totally get that as well. We find that a lot of our staff, actually, they'll go through our master classes and then go on to Charles Sturt or perhaps Murdoch here in Western Australia to complete an undergrad degree. But by being a lifelong learner, we're in a position, I think, then more easily to be able to show lecturers how to be teaching our students how to learn, because that's just going to be critical moving forward in this world. And I think you mentioned that, Tabatha, when you said it's not just about building our toolkits, it's really about helping build our students' toolkits. And to really understand how to do that, I think we just have to be learning ourselves.
Absolutely, I agree. Look, do either of you find that there are particular areas that you find, vet teachers commonly are looking to develop in their teaching practices? What sorts of things are they coming to you with, saying, I think I'm deficient in this sort of area. I really need to lift my, my practices here. Debra, do you find that there are some common things?
Yes, most definitely. Probably top of the list at the moment would be catering to our diverse learner cohorts. That's just an ongoing situation. Integrating technology into our teaching repertoires. And then, of course, when we're trialing all of these things that we've learnt about, but they're not working. So, there's great demand for, managing our learning environment, whether that's challenging behaviour or whether that's just in terms of our diverse learner cohort. And interestingly, the last one I've got here on my list is emotional intelligence. Developing our own emotional intelligence to be able to sort of transfer that ultimately across to our learners, and that involves things such as resilience building, providing emotional support, executive function, all of those sorts of things. So emotional intelligence is in demand as well in our part of the world.
Yeah, and it's important in many roles, actually, not just in teaching roles.
No,
yes, I take that. Susanne, did you have anything to add about common things that you find teachers are grappling with that they want to improve?
Yes, so I guess some key things with the action research projects that I support, some of the key things that come through those are language literacy and numeracy and support around that. Making assessment more accessible for students and for teachers, for trainers. So they're the things they're the two key things that come through the action research projects.
Mm.
Within the master's or the bachelor's degree, the key things that come through are people wanting to be able to use the language of learning. So they are usually doing they're usually doing quite good things, but they don't know how to put it into a framework or how to use the language around it. And that's also around adult learning. So that those things are important there. And again, something that you raised earlier, and that's reflection and how to do reflection themselves, and how to do reflection in such a way that it's useful for them over a long period of time, but also how to support reflection with their students. So yeah, they're the key things coming through.
Yeah, thank you. And we're almost out of time, but I do have a question from the audience. And the question is, what was the incidence of resistance to developing teaching skills from within the vet sector? Were there certain industry areas that were more likely to not look for development opportunities? And what does the sector do about that? Now, I certainly didn't find that in my research because, you know, probably because we were talking to teachers who excelled. But do either you, Debra, or Susanne, have you found this at all? Were there any particular industry areas where teachers are less likely to be looking to develop?
Look, I'd be hesitant to specify industry areas. I think there are probably, you know, some people who are perhaps less engaged with professional learning, but you know, there's a whole range of reasons for that. I'd be hard pressed to put that into industry categories, I think.
Yeah, and look, I think, and Susanne, you'll probably agree with this in relation to your comment about the sector being, you know, where the onus should be on the sector to support teachers to develop, but there is an individual element in how much a teacher will engage with that support. Would you agree with that?
Yes, although obviously I think that people can be better supported even if they're not keen to engage. But I haven't seen any research to show that there's particular areas of resistance, and I haven't seen it. I mean, I was in teacher education within a TAFE for 15 years, and I couldn't say, oh yes, that's the one. I won't say it, but that's it. But actually, no, I just didn't see it. But given that this is my area, maybe that's not something people are going to show me either. So yeah.
Very true, very true. Look, we're just about out of time. So before we go, I would just like to remind everybody that we've got our No Frills conference coming up. This year it's on the Gold Coast in July. I will be speaking about this project again. So if you want to see it again, please do come along. But we'll also have other NCVER researchers presenting on the work that they've done and other research that's been happening in the sector. So please do register and come along to the Gold Coast. We'd love to see you there. And lastly, if you'd like to hear more or keep up to date with what NCVER is doing, please head to our portal to subscribe to our newsletter or follow us on LinkedIn, X or YouTube. Thank you again to Debra and Susanne, our fantastic panelists. It's been a pleasure to have you online today. And I'd like to thank all of you who joined us to listen in today. Thank you.
Thanks, Tabatha.
And thank you for inviting me. It's such an important topic.
Thank you.